General Jordan Wicks, a celebrated war hero, never imagined that his most perilous encounter would unfold not on a distant battlefield, but on a quiet road in his homeland. During an ordinary drive, he found himself in a tense standoff with an aggressive police officer. It was a bright, sunny afternoon as General Jordan Wicks, a tall black man, drove down the main road in his sleek black SUV. Clad in his full military uniform, adorned with medals earned from years of dedicated service in the U.S. Army, he exuded pride and patriotism. Jordan was on his way to visit his mother, who lived in a nearby town. As he drove, a sense of accomplishment filled him. His journey to the rank of general in the U.S. Army, a position of honor and responsibility, had taken years of hard work. His thoughts drifted to his family, anticipating the joy of surprising his mother and seeing her happy smile. However, his peaceful reflections were suddenly disrupted by the flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. Startled, Jordan looked back to see a police car closely tailing him, its siren blaring and lights signaling him to pull over. Perplexed, he gently steered his SUV to the roadside, wondering why he had been stopped. He hadn't been speeding, and his vehicle was in perfect condition. As he parked and rolled down his window, Jordan took a calming breath, his heart beating a little faster. He reminded himself to stay composed, placing his hands on the wheel and preparing to cooperate, as he'd always believed in respecting the law and doing the right thing. Officer Clay, a white policeman, stepped out of his patrol car and approached. Broad-shouldered and tall, his expression was stern and unyielding. Jordan initially thought this might just be a routine stop, but as soon as Clay saw his face, the officer's demeanor changed. Jordan sensed the shift instantly. The officer's stance stiffened, his jaw clenched, and a frown appeared. Without any greeting or explanation, Clay barked, "Step out of the vehicle, now," his voice laced with a sharp, unprovoked aggression. Taken aback, Jordan asked calmly, "Officer, may I ask what the issue is?" Hoping to ease the tension, Clay repeated, "Step out of the car," this time even louder, his hand hovering near his holster, as though he was ready to draw his weapon. The air thickened with tension, palpable to Jordan. Despite his heart pounding, he stayed calm. He'd faced danger in combat, but this was different. This was his homeland, his own people. Slowly, he unfastened his seatbelt, opened the door and stood tall, his uniform gleaming under the afternoon sun. He made no sudden moves, determined to keep things peaceful. Clay's eyes narrowed as he sized Jordan up, his gaze lingering on the uniform. A brief pause followed, perhaps a moment of recognition of Jordan's military attire. Yet, instead of respect, Clay's expression contorted into a sneer. "What are you doing driving around here?" he demanded, his tone thick with suspicion. Clay hadn't even asked Jordan for his license or registration, the typical protocol. Instead, his attention was fixed on one thing: the color of Jordan's skin. "I'm just on my way to visit my mother," Jordan replied, his tone calm, though a surge of frustration simmered within. Why was he being singled out this way? He'd done nothing wrong. After all, he was a U.S. Army general, a position that should have earned him respect. Yet Clay wasn't paying attention. He moved closer, his face inches from Jordan's. "You're lying," Clay sneered. "You're not from around here, are you?" Jordan clenched his jaw, choosing to stay silent. He knew engaging with someone so hostile would only make things worse. He glanced around and noticed a few passing cars slowing down, their drivers casting curious glances at the scene, while some pedestrians on the sidewalk stopped to watch, concern growing in their expressions. "What do you have in the car?" Clay asked abruptly, his voice laced with accusation. "Drugs? Weapons?" he demanded, ordering Jordan to step back while reaching for his gun. Jordan's heart skipped a beat. Was this really happening? He had risked his life for his country, only to be treated like a criminal in his own hometown. Thoughts of his family rushed into his mind, and he wondered what they would think if this encounter went wrong or how his career might be affected. Slowly, he raised his hands, signaling he wasn't a threat. "Officer, I'm unarmed. I'm not a criminal." "I'm a general in the U.S. Army," he said, hoping Clay would listen. But Clay's grip tightened on his gun as his gaze remained locked on Jordan, treating him not as a citizen but as an adversary. Tension filled the air, thick and suffocating, and Jordan felt trapped, unable to predict what would happen next. Fear welled up inside him as his mind imagined the worst possibilities. Would Clay draw his gun? Was this how his life would end, in a situation he'd never thought possible? As Clay's hand hovered near his weapon, the moments stretched endlessly, and Jordan held his breath, unsure of what might happen. Standing outside his car with his hands raised slightly, Jordan made another attempt to explain. "Officer, I'm General Jordan Wicks, serving in the U.S. Army," he stated clearly, his tone respectful despite the growing knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. Though he was trained to handle high-stakes situations, nothing in his military career had prepared him for this. But Clay wasn't listening. His face flushed with anger, his gaze cold and filled with accusation. "You expect me to believe that?" he spat. "A general? You're lying. Get down on the ground now." Jordan's heart sank. How had this spiraled so quickly? He could feel the weight of people's eyes on him. Drivers slowing down, pedestrians pausing, some even pulling out their phones to record. The murmur of the crowd grew louder as more people gathered. Some looked on with concern, while others remained frozen, unsure of how to help. Jordan took a deep breath, his voice steady as he said, "Officer, if you'll allow me to show you my ID, I can clear this up." But before he could finish, Clay shoved him down forcefully. "Now!" Clay shouted, his voice echoing across the street. With no choice, Jordan lowered himself to his knees, feeling the scorching heat of the asphalt through his uniform pants. His heart thundered as Clay grabbed his arm roughly and forced him flat on the ground. The harsh pavement pressed into him as Clay's knee dug into his back, applying brutal pressure. Jordan winced, struggling to stay composed as he felt the searing heat of the pavement against his cheek. Breathing was a struggle, each gasp burning in his chest. The crowd reacted more strongly now, voices rising as people pleaded with the officer. "Hey, stop! He didn't do anything," someone yelled. "Let him up," called another voice. Others watched in stunned silence, clearly disturbed but hesitant to intervene. Phones captured the unfolding scene, their clicks and beeps echoing around him. Jordan was no longer just a man heading to visit his mother. He was now the center of a public spectacle. Despite everything, he forced himself to remain still, his mind racing. His military training had taught him to stay calm under intense pressure. But this situation was unlike any battle he'd ever faced. Clay, seemingly unfazed by the growing crowd or the recording devices, leaned closer, his voice low and venomous. "I know your type," he hissed. "You think you're above the law. But not today." Jordan's mind raced, filled with disbelief, anger, and fear. None of this felt right. After all, he had served his country honorably, risking his life to protect the freedoms that this officer was sworn to uphold. And yet, here he lay, face down on the pavement, treated like a criminal for no other reason than the color of his skin. He felt tears threatening to well up but forced them back. He couldn't let Clay see him break. His thoughts drifted to the battles he had fought overseas, the comrades he had led, and the sacrifices he had made. Never did he imagine that one of his hardest battles would unfold here, in his own country, on a quiet afternoon. Around him, the crowd continued to grow, their voices louder and more urgent. "This isn't right," a woman cried, her voice wavering. "Somebody stop him." Closing his eyes momentarily, Jordan willed himself to stay calm. He wondered what his family would think if they saw this. His mother, waiting for him at home, had always been so proud of him. Would she end up seeing this scene on the news? Would this be the lasting image of General Jordan Wicks, a man who had dedicated his life to serving his country? The pressure on his back intensified as Clay shifted his weight, and for a moment, Jordan wondered if this was how it would end, if he would join the long list of those wronged by injustice. His breaths came shallow and rapid, but he continued to hold on, praying someone would intervene before things got worse. But what could he do? Unarmed and with no means to defend himself, even his uniform, meant to symbolize bravery and honor, seemed powerless in this moment. His mind raced, desperately trying to think of ways to defuse the situation, to appeal to reason, but Clay seemed unreachable, consumed by anger and prejudice. As he lay there, the uncertainty gnawed at him. Would anyone in the crowd have the courage to step in? Or would they simply stand by, watching in silence? Every second dragged painfully under the weight of Clay's knee, and Jordan struggled to remain calm. The helplessness he felt was unlike anything he had ever experienced. As the crowd's voices grew louder, the suspense thick in the air, leaving everyone on edge, wondering what might happen next. Just as the situation seemed at its breaking point, the piercing sound of another police siren filled the street. A second patrol car pulled up. The crowd, still growing, now buzzing with murmurs, turned to see what would happen. From the car stepped Lieutenant Daniels, his uniform crisp, his expression serious, as he approached the tense scene. Lieutenant Daniels' eyes quickly locked onto the sight of Clay's knee pressed into Jordan's back, with a stunned crowd looking on. Recognizing Jordan at once, Daniels' face hardened. He recalled memories of serving alongside Jordan in a high-stakes rescue mission overseas. "What on earth are you doing, Clay?" Lieutenant Daniels shouted, his voice filled with authority as he moved closer. The crowd fell silent, the tension thick in the air. Clay, visibly startled by his superior's sudden arrival, hesitated, his face going pale. He stood up quickly, stepping back from Jordan, who remained on the ground, bruised but maintaining his dignity. Daniels looked down at Jordan, his expression a mixture of shock and anger. "General Wicks?" he asked softly, disbelief in his voice. He helped Jordan to his feet, who dusted himself off without saying a word, the pain from the rough treatment lingering. But it was the deeper hurt, the realization that his uniform and rank meant nothing in that moment, that weighed on him most. Turning back to Clay, Lieutenant Daniels' face was flushed with anger. "Do you even realize who this man is?" he demanded, his voice rising. "This is General Jordan Wicks, a decorated officer in the U.S. Army, a hero. What were you thinking?" Clay, now visibly shaken, tried to justify his actions, his hands trembling. He looked suspicious. "I thought," he stammered, but Daniels cut him off, his eyes blazing with disbelief. "Suspicious? You pulled him over for no reason, treated him like a criminal, and pinned him to the ground. All because of how he looked." The crowd, which had been quietly recording and watching, stood in stunned silence, the weight of the situation sinking in. Their phones were still raised, but now, the gravity of what they were witnessing had left them speechless. All eyes were on Clay, who stood there, fumbling for words, his face drained of color as he began to realize the full impact of his mistake. Glancing nervously between Daniels, the crowd, and Jordan, Clay's voice faltered as he stammered, I didn't know. I didn't realize he was." But Daniels cut him off, his voice thick with contempt. "You didn't stop to ask, you didn't stop to listen. Instead, you assumed the worst." The crowd stood motionless, every word hanging heavily in the air. Clay's breaths were shallow, a mix of panic and guilt paralyzing him as he remained rooted in place. Jordan, despite the pain he felt, now stood tall. His gaze was fixed on Clay, and in his eyes was a deep sadness mixed with disappointment. For a moment, everything seemed to slow as Jordan absorbed the weight of the incident. Would things have been different if he hadn't been a general? If he hadn't been in uniform, his medals gleaming on his chest? Would Clay still have treated him this way? The sheer unfairness of it gnawed at him, leaving a bitter taste. Lieutenant Daniels' expression softened as he turned to Jordan, his voice filled with remorse. "General, I'm deeply sorry for what's happened here," he said. "It never should have come to this. Not for you, not for anyone." The crowd, still tense, seemed to shift. Some began murmuring softly. Others just stared in stunned silence, trying to grasp the significance of what had unfolded. The anger and fear in the air had now transformed into something more complicated, shame and disbelief. Jordan stood quietly, bruised and weary. Though he had faced tremendous challenges on the battlefield, this moment, a senseless act of discrimination in his own country, felt like a wound that struck deeper than words could convey. Finally, he spoke, his tone steady but filled with purpose. "Lieutenant, thank you. But this isn't just about me. This is about what's wrong here. This could have happened to anyone." His words hung in the air, heavy with truth. Clay, realizing the enormity of his actions, looked down, his hands shaking. The prejudice that had clouded his judgment was now painfully obvious. The crowd remained still, waiting, wondering what would come next. Daniels placed a reassuring hand on Jordan's shoulder, silently conveying his regret. Although the worst was over, the emotional scars left by the incident wouldn't be so easily healed. Jordan stood firm, but within him was a turbulent storm of emotions. Would Clay genuinely learn from this? Would this incident bring any real change? Or would history simply repeat itself with different faces, in different places? Daniels turned to Clay, his expression stern and resolute. "Officer Clay, you owe General Wicks an apology," he said, his voice low and unyielding. The crowd, silent once more, watched intently, waiting for Clay's response. Shaken, Clay nodded, though he hesitated. His hands trembled, and beads of sweat formed on his forehead. "I'm sorry," he muttered, his voice barely audible, his gaze fixed on the ground. He couldn't meet Jordan's eyes. "That's not enough," Daniels snapped. "Speak up, Clay. Everyone needs to hear you." Clay swallowed hard, raising his head slightly. His voice was louder this time, though still unsteady. "I'm sorry, General Wicks. I made a mistake." The crowd, which had initially been filled with anger, now watched in a stunned, uneasy silence. Some onlookers whispered among themselves, unsure how to react. A few people had stopped recording, but others still held their phones up, capturing the moment. Jordan, bruised yet unbroken, looked steadily at Clay, saying nothing, though the intensity of his gaze conveyed everything left unsaid. Lieutenant Daniels turned back to Jordan, his expression a blend of respect and apology. "General, I've already filed a report on Clay's behavior. He will be suspended immediately and face an investigation," Daniels stated, his tone firm. "This behavior is unacceptable, and I assure you it won't be ignored." Clay's face paled as the reality of his actions began to dawn on him. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but then closed it, weighed down by the shame of what he had done. For the first time, he seemed to grasp the gravity of his actions. Jordan stood quietly, processing the events. He had every right to demand justice, to see Clay held fully accountable. But as he looked at the officer, visibly shaken, remorseful, and burdened by his own guilt, Jordan felt conflicted. Thoughts raced through his mind, of the countless people who had faced similar experiences, often without anyone stepping in. He knew he had been fortunate that Lieutenant Daniels had arrived when he did, but he also understood that many others weren't so lucky. Part of him wanted Clay to face the full consequences of his actions, but another part held onto the hope that people could change, that mistakes could lead to growth. As he stood there, a storm of emotions churned within him. Anger, sadness, frustration, and, above all, a longing for a better, more just world. After a moment's silence, Jordan finally broke the silence, his voice steady yet authoritative. "Lieutenant, thank you for your quick response," he said, pausing, as the crowd leaned in, hanging on his words. "I don't wish to press charges." A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. Clay looked up in astonishment, his eyes wide with disbelief. He had expected severe consequences, perhaps even legal ones, for his actions. Lieutenant Daniels, surprised, raised an eyebrow. "Sir, are you certain?" he asked gently, his tone filled with respect. Jordan nodded firmly. "This experience has been a lesson for him," he explained, fixing his gaze on Clay. "Justice matters, but so does the potential for change. If Clay can learn from this, If it leads to him becoming a better person, that's the outcome I want. Clay stood frozen, still trying to absorb Jordan's decision. The weight of it settled over him, heavy and daunting. For a moment, there was silence in the crowd. Then slowly, applause broke out. Quiet at first, but soon swelling with relief and admiration. Some cheered, voices rising in support of Jordan's choice. Jordan stood still, his face composed, though his heart held a swirl of complex emotions. He was proud of choosing a higher path, yet a sadness lingered. This incident, he realized, wasn't unique. It reflected a larger, entrenched issue without a simple solution. He thought about others who had been in his position, those who hadn't been able to walk away, those who had suffered without a voice. As he reached his car and opened the door, he glanced back at Clay, who remained in the same spot, pale and slouched. Clay stared at Jordan, his face unreadable, as if trying to comprehend the mercy he had just been shown. The unanswered question hung heavily in the air. Would Clay truly change? Would this serve as a turning point? Or would he revert to old habits once the moment passed? Jordan couldn't know, and that uncertainty weighed on him. Stay connected for more gripping stories that challenge perspectives and bring you closer to truths that matter. Subscribe now to stay updated on our latest content, where each story draws you deeper into life's realities, keeping you engaged with every moment.